Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for this discussion today on Black Lives Matter at the United Nations. Thank you especially for joining us at the last minute as we pulled this webinar together, given the urgent need for this discussion to happen. So we appreciate everyone who's jumped on Zoom at the last minute. I mean, literally this webinar has been organized in the past 2 hours. So we really appreciate you. To those of you who are on YouTube and you are joining us there, thank you again. Today we are here talking about the urgent debate that took place yesterday and today at the United Nations on Black Lives Matter. And I am incredibly grateful to have two very esteemed panelists with me. I'll introduce myself briefly. My name is Mishra-Newbery, former executive director of Women's March Global. And today we're gonna just jump into this discussion. I invite you, as we are discussing this and as you are hearing what Salimah and Salma are sharing, if you have questions, whether you are listening on YouTube or you are on Zoom, to please ask those questions of Salma and Salimah, either on the Zoom Q&A or on YouTube. And I will be moderating the discussion and will have open time for your questions at the end. So without further ado, I want to introduce Salma Al-Hosseiny. She works for the Geneva-based human rights NGO, International Service for Human Rights, and leads the advocacy around the Human Rights Council. She is fearless. I have seen her in action. She's incredible. And Salimah Hankins, she's the executive director of the US Human Rights Network, which is a national network of grassroots and advocacy organizations and individuals working to strengthen a human rights movement and culture within the United States, led by the people most directly impacted by human rights violations. Thank you, both of you, for joining me at the very last minute and for taking the time to have this discussion. Salimah, I want to start off with you and ask you the first question, which is the US Human Rights Network was part of the global call for accountability, which was signed by over 660 organizations from 66 countries that joined the families of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Michael Brown, and Philando Castile in calling for justice and accountability. Can you talk about what has been asked of the United Nations? Many people might not know of that accountability action that was taken. So can you talk about that and what has been asked of the United Nations and why this action was taken to seek justice on an international level?
Thank you so much, for having me, and for Salma as well. So yeah, I want to talk a little bit about what's being asked, but also give a little bit of context for how this came about. So I think that might help folks sort of who may not necessarily be familiar with the human rights structure, but are really interested in what's happening at the international level with regard to this issue, since it's kind of gotten a lot of attention recently. So my organization, as you mentioned, we are like working to build a grassroots movement in the US to look at human rights violations that actually happen in the US, because the US has been one of the most active sort of international actors with calling out human rights violations that happen in other places, but then sort of stall and do everything to make sure that human rights violations that happen in the US are not uplifted in the international space. So we've been doing this work kind of on a smaller scale. We've brought Trayvon Martin's mother and Mike Brown's parents and Jordan Davis's dad to the UN to testify on the human rights violations that have happened. But those are sort of smaller, or I would say like more contained processes. And they look at a specific moment in time, and usually that what comes from that is a report. And those things are actually really important, but we wanted to utilize the energy in this moment to actually think bigger about what could possibly be done. You know, we were there watching the video of George Floyd and the outrage and the uprising that happened after that, not just in the US, but around the world. And we thought, how do we translate what's happening around the world, not just in the US, but also people are protesting what's happening in their own countries with their minority populations as well. So we started to think, how do we, what would be a more concrete way to hold the US accountable? And we thought we should go to the Human Rights Council. I want to acknowledge that it was the ACLU's Human Rights Program, Jamil Dakwar, and Professor Gay McDougall, who's a former member of the UN Committee on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination, that really helped to pull this effort together, made sure they pulled us into this. And then we decided that what we will do is send a letter on behalf of civil society to the UN asking for a special session. And the reason why that's important is that we've had special sessions before when there's a human rights crisis. If something happens in Latin America or in the Middle East, the US is the first one to say, hey, let's hold these countries accountable, but that has never happened with regard to the US. So and so we wanted to really uplift what is happening in the US. In addition to that, so we reached out to the lawyer, Ben Crump's office, who represents the family of George Floyd and some of the other families. And they were doing their own sort of separate effort to try to really push this effort internationally. So they agreed to join the letter. We've got other families who reached out to us. We would have had more families, but this all happened extremely quickly. It was probably within the last 10 days. We sent out a call for organizations, and within, I think it was like 48 hours, we had more than 600 organizations sign on. And I think we extended it a little longer. We submitted the request to the Human Rights Council, and because and we did get a response, and I'll have Salma talk a little bit about the Africa group and what their response was. But I want to say, like I said, why this is felt really important is because this feels like this is the moment to hold the US accountable. What a special session would do, or is what we were hoping is that with a special session, then you would get a resolution that would mandate an independent commission of inquiry. And that is really important. This would be an independent body of human rights experts and other types of experts from all over the world that would do a deep dive into what's happening in the United States, particularly as it pertains to police violence and impunity, extrajudicial killings, and also the response of the US government to the protesters, including attacking journalists. And this has come from the very top, from the Trump administration. So it's very important for us to make sure that this was a robust process that we're asking for. What we're seeking right now is that we had the debate, and what we're seeking right now is to make sure that the strongest version of the resolution that will call for an independent commission of inquiry gets passed, so that we can then use this to support the work that's happening on the ground. And I'll turn it over to Salma to talk a little bit about that transition from a special session to where we are right now.
Great, thank you so much, Salimah, for that really great explanation, especially for those people who don't know how the UN mechanism works. Salma, can you then, as Salimah had said, take it over and then talk about the Africa group and how that transition works, and then I'll ask you a follow-up question behind that.
Sure. First of all, thank you very much for organizing this in such a last minute, and thank you all for joining us today. So the African group on Friday, they made a request for an urgent debate, which is essentially the same thing, to make a space to discuss this issue and on the agenda of the Human Rights Council. And so the debate then took place yesterday, and then it continued tomorrow morning. And alongside the debate, they also presented a resolution, which is basically a decision that the Human Rights Council can take. And they are requesting the Human Rights Council to appoint an independent commission of inquiry. And so this move aligns with the call that Salimah was talking about, that was made in the letter by the families and by 600 human rights civil society groups from across the world. So let me just explain what this commission of inquiry actually is. So these are, first of all, this is one of the most powerful mechanisms that the Human Rights Council can create, right? And this sends a very powerful message in itself, just the name Commission of Inquiry. And then second, technically it is essentially an international investigative body, and it is designed and resourced by the UN to look into serious situations of violations of international human rights law. So they're formed of a group of experts, and they collect information, they investigate, they establish the facts, the circumstances, and they really play a critical role in promoting accountability, both for past violations and also for preventing future violations. So this is essentially what they have proposed, and maybe I'll just stop there and then see the follow-up question.
Great, thank you so much, Salma. I mean, my follow-up question has to do with the statement that you gave today on behalf of the ACLU at the Human Rights Council. And in that statement, you say that this council must ensure that the outcomes of this urgent debate is focused on efforts to hold the United States accountable. Can you talk about the accountability that is being called for by the Africa Group, and why specifically? And I know that a couple of member states pointed this out in their statements as well, that this is very historic on an international level, especially this being led by the Africa Group as well. Can you speak to that, please?
Yes, of course. No, this is definitely a historic moment. I personally think that business as usual is not going to happen after this, no matter what the outcome is. This already made history. It's the first time ever that a country from the global north is scrutinized like this by the Human Rights Council. If you had asked me this, Uma, 3 weeks ago, like before the letter, before all of this, I would have said that's a far-fetched fantasy. But the African leadership has made us think that the impossible is possible. And that in itself is powerful, regardless of the outcome, right? And so by doing this, they have made an extremely bold and ambitious move. They stood up to one of the most influential and powerful countries in the world, right? And in doing so, they are exposing to the world the hypocrisy of Western governments, which brings me to what happened after they have proposed this commission of inquiry. So listening to the statements this week, right, like by Western governments during the negotiations and during the urgent debate, which I encourage you to watch, even though I warn you, it will make your gut turn. I myself was in the room and I couldn't hold my tears in the debate, and have been listening for years to hypocritical statements by governments, but that really, it was quite, can't articulate. It made my guts turn. So essentially, these Western governments who preach human rights, but in reality, it's not the human rights of everyone, right? Because their argument is essentially saying that Black lives don't matter as much when they're killed by US officials as when they're killed in Africa. Because remember, these are the same Western governments who are setting up commissions of inquiry and international investigations in other countries in Africa, Asia, and Latin America. And they are the ones who lobby the African group to support these resolutions, right? And support these investigations. And then the moment that the African group decides to say, well, the US is also violating human rights. And this is serious because Black Lives Matter, and we are willing to stand up. And then the Western government say, well, actually, racism is a global problem. We all have our problems. This is not appropriate. We trust the US institutions and their transparency. And so this is essentially where we're at right now. I know it's shameful, and I really hope that this video can be watched by citizens of these governments, because we have seen the thousands and tens of thousands of protesters across the world that are going in the streets demanding an end to this. And I'm sure that if they know that their representatives are doing this in the UN, they will not be happy, and they will ask them questions, and they will hold them accountable. Yeah.
Thank you so much. I mean, Salma, everything that you said, both Salimah and I were like, yes, yes, and yes. I mean, it is the statements, and I was watching them on UN Live TV yesterday, and they are shameful from the Western governments. Go ahead, Salma.
Can I just say something? Because actually, the debate yesterday was opened by the brother of George Floyd. So he spoke before the states spoke, and he looked them in the eyes, and he pleaded for help, and he explained what's happening in the US. And they listened to this, and then they still said, all lives matter.
Yeah. Salimah,
here. I just want to add to that I too was really disgusted by those, just one comment after the other, especially after Philonise Floyd's like very, very impassioned plea. He talked in detail about watching the video and having his brother call for his mother, and what message that sends to people around the world, and that could have been him, and imploring the UN to really sort of do something. And many of the states didn't mention him at all, didn't acknowledge what happened. Only a few states actually acknowledged what happened. And so I think I think you're right, Salma, that this is deplorable, and that if the citizens of these countries actually knew what it is that their governments were doing on their behalf, as they're in the streets marching, saying Black Lives Matter, I think that there would be serious repercussions. And I think one of the things we're hoping to do with this webinar is to get folks to really sort of reach out, talk to their representatives in Geneva and in Washington, DC, to really put pressure on them, because this is the moment where they have the opportunity to make a decision about what they stand for. Do they believe that Black Lives Matter, or is it going to be business as usual? It's interesting because it is an urgent debate, and it did not feel urgent. Those comments just felt like they could have been, prepared weeks ago and just read off of a prompter. And I think that was the thing that was disheartening for me and many of our members who are actually watching that.
Salimah,
can I just add just one more thing? And because their argument was, racism is a problem everywhere, so why are you singling out the United States, right? But it's really important to know that the resolution or this commission of inquiry that the African group proposed does not only say the United States, it names the United States because it needs to be named, right? But it also says and other parts of the world. And so their argument was not investigate us all. Their argument was don't investigate anyone.
Exactly. And that distinction is so incredibly important. Salimah, I want to go back to you. You are based in the United States. Both Salma and I are in Geneva. And as a Black woman in America, can you speak to the experience of being a Black woman in America, especially in this time, but also working in the international sector within the human rights space, and what it means to have this international attention?
Yeah, thank you for asking that. I just think that the last 2 or 3 weeks have been a roller coaster, I think for all of us. But particularly for Black folks in America, we were already contending with, the fact that we're disproportionately dying from COVID due to systemic racism, and then also overt racism within the medical profession. So we've been dealing with this, and then you have this, other ways that we're disproportionately impacted. We're frontline workers, we are less likely to be able to work from home and sort of protect ourselves from COVID in that way. So that's something that was already building that fear. And then when you see this video of George Floyd, which many folks who I've talked to said that they couldn't watch it at all, like they know what happened, but really it was just too much for them. I think that there was just collective triggering. And that's what I felt like. People were just so triggered and out in the street. I've had my own experiences with police, even as a lawyer, even as a person who's like trying to explain, you know, like really scary run-ins with the police that where I just felt like I wasn't listened to and wasn't human. And it's interesting to be working in human rights where we're trying to sort of really show that we are human beings and have that not be respected, right? And then, so I think that there was this collective triggering. What many of us witnessed growing up, either as Black men or trans folks or women, it, you know, like it really impacts all of us, either directly or through the fact that we have family members who are impacted by this. So for me, from that perspective, I have been really sort of distraught and then also really encouraged by just like the movement that has happened. It feels like being gaslit for years and saying, this has happened, this has happened, this has happened, and no one really listening except for a few people, and then the world waking up at one time. And that feels amazing to me. And then to bring that sort of into the international space, and I'm very, very, very encouraged by how quickly this has happened. I mean, we just got all of this energy and support, and then we sent this letter, and that I'm so grateful for the Africa group to respond. But I want to also say it's not lost on me that it was Black folks from around the world who had to respond. It was African leaders coming through for Africans and people of African descent around the world and saying, this is important. This is about white supremacy. This is about systemic oppression. This is not a one-off. This is not about bad apples. So I'm encouraged by like all of the movement that has happened around the world, and also specifically in the United States. However, I think we've demonstrated as a country that we cannot be trusted and that our systems are actually not working. So we need that international intervention. And so I'm really encouraged by that. At the same time, really disappointed but unsurprised that Western countries like Australia and other Western countries that are on the Human Rights Council are just sort of like, you know, not taking it as seriously, or are like not showing the political leadership that it would take to actually get something meaningful passed. It's important also that we want to make sure that the resolution, or as Salma was saying, that the decision is a strong decision. It is an independent commission of inquiry, not something watered down, not saying, oh, we'll just issue some report by the human, the High Commissioner or the special rapporteurs, which are really important, but that's not what we're asking for. It's not what the families are asking for. When I heard George Floyd's brother pleading with this body, and to have them not respond, it really felt to me like, oh, yeah, Black lives don't matter. Like you said, it's all lives matter. So yeah, it's been a roller coaster, but I'm so appreciative of all of the people who have just been really supportive and who have come and really stepped up to really help to support and prop up the work that the people of color are doing on the ground.
Thank you so much, Salimah, for that. And, you know, as you said, and both you and Salma have said this, that even after that video from George Floyd's brother and the statements that were, the All Lives Matter statements that were given by so many of the Western countries, one of the reports in some of this next question is for you. One of the reports that came out from Reuters yesterday was the lobbying behind the scenes from the United States and Australia, lobbying other member states to waver on their support of the Africa Group statement. And South Africa and Palestine both delivered very strong statements saying very unequivocally that, not supporting this resolution is a form of racism. I think this was South Africa that said that. And can you speak to, one, many people are not aware of the intense lobbying efforts that go on in the Human Rights Council and how our human rights are negotiated off the table by our respective governments. So can you speak to that, but then also what that wavering could mean for the accountability on an international level?
Yeah. So before I get to that, I just really want to pause here for a minute and to really applaud the courage and the resistance of some African states. So the debate yesterday, Namibia was the only country to condemn the racism and police violence in the USA and say it, right? Like not in general terms. Botswana and Sierra Leone, they showed courage that the other countries sacrificed alongside their principles. And of course, South Africa, as you mentioned, who made a very powerful statement. And the ambassador urged states to really stand on the right side of history and to not diminish or minimalize or generalize the issue. And she said that because this itself would be a form of racism in itself. So that's first. Now, what's happening right now at the UN is that, as you said, the US is bullying. It's bullying the African countries to make them not do this initiative. They left the Human Rights Council, right? But that doesn't mean that their impact, their influence has not left. And European governments as well. And like, it's not a comprehensive list, but for example, I was shocked by countries like Germany to be lobbying African countries and telling them to remove any reference of the words United States of America from the text. This is exactly what has been happening for the past few days. I mean, it's not webcast it's not live streamed on the official UN website, but this is what's happening on the corridors, and this is what I'm sure that citizens don't know, that their governments are using. I mean, their salaries are taxpayer money, right? So taxpayer money right now, these Western governments and the US is being used to shield the US from scrutiny and to effectively try to dismantle or to kill the initiative that the African group brought, which is to bring the Black Lives Matter to really the UN and not just lip service, right? Because all of these statements have just been a lip service. Now, of course, this was not a surprise, right? Like, we expected that this would happen from the US and from the Western governments like the EU, Australia, for example. But I think there's something else here other than US bullying. I mean, that's obviously one big part of it. But I also think that they are in survival mode because they realize that this is a game changer. This will change power dynamics in the Human Rights Council forever. And sooner or later, they will be next. So in other words, they are afraid that if this passes, then they too will come under investigation by the Human Rights Council for their violations. And here I want to mention that in the debate yesterday, the UN High Commissioner, she called for reparations to Black Americans. She said that, and I quote her, "Behind today's racial violence, systemic racism and discriminatory policing lay the failure to acknowledge and confront the legacy of the slave trade and colonialism." And I think that hit a nerve. But what we didn't expect was Mexico. We didn't expect that Mexico will be a US proxy leading Latin American countries trying to kill this initiative and to push for the removal of any reference to the words United States of America from the text. I think this was a very big deception because, I mean, yeah, this was definitely not expected. And this is what we're up against. And now the negotiations are still ongoing. I don't know what will happen tomorrow. They should decide on the resolution. Every day it was supposed to decide yesterday, and then it was supposed to decide today, and now it's going to be tomorrow. But all of this tells me that it's not decided yet. It tells me that some African countries are still resisting the pressure. They are not giving in. They are trying from all this pressure from the US and from European countries to kill it. And they are resisting. And we are supporting. We are still fighting, and we are doing everything that we possibly can to make this pass and to hold not only the United States government accountable, but Western governments as well. And then in terms of like the impacts of this has beyond the situation in the United States, I just want to say that, I mean, I don't know what's going to happen tomorrow, right? But if this fails, like if the Commission of Inquiry is not adopted, I don't think this will be a failure on us or civil society or all of this, movement and mobilization. And it is not a failure of Africa. It's not a failure of African countries. It will be a failure of Western governments, right? And their proxies who have exposed their hypocrisy, and they exposed that they are only paying lip service to Black Lives Matter.
And exposing the white supremacy culture within the United Nations.
Yes, exactly. And to end on a positive note, if this succeeds, it will show that no state, no matter how powerful, how influential, is not above scrutiny, and that the movement in the street, right, can be brought to the UN and can change international politics. Like it will show that there is this disconnect between what happens in the UN that no one understands and no one knows about is completely disconnected from the street. Like the fight that is happening in the street, this is the fight that we're having now in the UN.
Yes. Thank you so much, Salma, for that breakdown. Super helpful.
I want to add one thing, that if this does not pass tomorrow, that will send a big message, because tomorrow is Juneteenth. And it's this commemoration of the ending of slavery. We're talking about the vestiges of slavery right now. And it will really send a message that Black lives don't matter if on Juneteenth this resolution doesn't pass.
Thank you so much, Salimah, for saying that. I wanna end with you, Salimah, and ask you a question. And just a reminder, we've gotten a couple of questions in from YouTube. For those of you on Zoom that are watching, if you do have questions, please pop them into our Q&A, and I promise we will do our best to get to them at the end of this webinar. Salimah, being based in the US, but then also witnessing all of the global marches that have happened and the Black Lives Matter marches that have happened around the world, and especially taking what happens at the United Nations to the general public. What is needed right now from the general public to ensure that this resolution moves forward, especially given the resistance that Mexico is putting up and the United States?
We need folks to, right after this webinar, call the foreign ministries, particularly of Mexico and the Western countries, other countries in Latin America. We actually have a list, and I'm not sure how I should disseminate a link to our website where folks can see the action that they should take. Reach out and say you support the Africa group. You want the United Nations to show that Black Lives Matter. That means that you want the resolution to be passed as is, to support an independent commission of inquiry. We understand that this is not going to solve systemic racism in the US. But like Salma was saying, it's about the grassroots. It's about the people on the ground, the movement for Black lives, folks who are asking for specific things and being able to have those things highlighted at the international level. That's what an independent commission of inquiry would do. You would have folks actually coming in and taking into account and incorporating what's being asked for on the ground. So I can pop it in the chat if that will be helpful. Just a link to our website. It has ISHR's, some information from ISHR around why this is important, what is needed, but we really need folks to reach out right now and just really, really put pressure in the way that the US governments and their proxies are putting pressure on these governments. I don't know if Salma, you want to add to that, but that's the main ask that we have right now.
Because we have been sending alerts every day saying it's tomorrow. And I just want to say, like, it's not like we need to keep pushing until they make a decision, because just the fact that this keeps getting delayed, it means that it's not over yet. It means that there is an opportunity to do pressure, and this is really a historical moment, and I encourage everyone to take part of it.
Thank you so much, Salma, and thank you. I want to ask a couple of questions that have come in on the chat and also on YouTube. So Salma, this one is for you. Has a resolution, this is coming in from YouTube, has a resolution on the commission been adopted? If so, what is the mandate of the commission? If there is additional support for the creation of a commission, where should it be sent?
So it was not adopted yet, because this is what we are trying to make happen, okay? And the decision that the Africa Group presented establishes the commission on the US and other parts of the world. So this means that they would have the mandate to go anywhere. The only thing is that they have to be, the government that they want to go to has to accept their visit. Like, they cannot, like, for example, if the United States government doesn't accept that they can go, they will not be able to enter, and the same for other countries. But that doesn't mean that they cannot do their work, because, for example, there are other commissions of inquiry, like, for example, on Syria, just to name one on the top of my head. Obviously, they have been denied access to Syria, but they have been doing amazing work that is now ending up in courts, right? And so this is the possibility, and this is why this needs to pass, because it's not only about the US. This is about Black Lives Matter everywhere in the world.
And a follow-up to that, Salma, from another person, will this resolution affect the EU and members' border policies and address the attention to the abuses at home within the EU?
Of course, and this is exactly why they don't want to make it happen, because they know that their heads are on the line as well.
Awesome, thank you so much. And Salimah, a recognition from another viewer on YouTube that if Juneteenth is a reckoning of so much, if it can't pass, if this resolution cannot pass on that date, it does indeed send a powerful message. Do you want to follow up on that?
Yes, I just want to concur with that. And then we as a movement have to figure out how we respond, because we're moving forward. Like you said, we want to be, if they don't want to be on the right side of history, they make that clear, but it doesn't mean that we can't hold them accountable in their own countries and figure out what the path forward is. So that will be their decision, but also we have agency as well as a movement.
Fantastic. I am just sharing Salimah's link here to the US Human Rights Network and their call to action, both on Zoom and on YouTube. Salma, I just want to pass the floor over to you, and then you, Salimah, for any final thoughts and closing statements, as it were, on this webinar, and then we will close it out. Salma, turn it over to you.
No, just 2 points that I want to make. First, I concur with what Salimah is doing. No matter what happens tomorrow, this is just the beginning, and it's not the end. Because what the African group, the ambition and the bold move that they made has already made history, regardless of the outcome. And at least here in Geneva, we will make sure to keep pushing and pushing and pushing and pushing, and this is not over. And then the second point that I want to make, and And this argument is now directed at if there are any state officials of Western governments that are watching, right? So I'm going to change my tone and not talk to citizens and not to talk to the governments now. I want them to realize what the stakes are at. I want them to realize that the initiatives that they champion at the Human Rights Council, both thematic and country specific, they are jeopardizing all of that, right? I mean, this was an African group position. It was not just one country, it was a group. And they rely on the African group to get the resolutions passed. And I just want them to reflect about how they would be able to continue working and pushing their own agendas after this week.
Thank you so much, Salma. Salimah.
I wanted to say that this effort is in a long line of activists who have been doing work in the US. I think a little bit about Marcus Garvey and his appeal to the League of Nations. I think of Malcolm X going to Cairo to internationalize the issue of human rights violations within the United States. I think about Martin Luther King. I think about W.E.B. Du Bois and the NAACP and their appeal to the world. All of this was trying to bring international attention to this issue. So I feel like even if it does not pass tomorrow, that we are still in a tradition of a long line of people who are advocates pushing for the internationalization of this issue of human rights violations against Black Americans. And I feel like Salma said that even if we, no matter what happens tomorrow, the fact that the Africa group stepped up, the fact that there's this energy around the world is really, really encouraging for us. And we're just gonna take that momentum and ride it forward. So thank you so much for inviting me. And I wanna also thank the families, George Floyd, Philando Castile, Breonna Taylor, and Michael Brown for just their support and their diligence in all of this, particularly when dealing with the trauma of what they experienced. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Salimah. And thank you so much, Salma. Just to wrap it up, and so you, for those of you who have joined us on Zoom, and thank you again for joining us at the last minute, and for those of you who are watching on YouTube, we will be replaying this webinar on our Facebook page in about an hour, and reposting some of these links that have been shared so that you know exactly where to take action. I invite you all to follow, and we will post this on our Twitter and also on Facebook, the US Human Rights Network and also the International Service for Human Rights. They are the ones that are on the front lines reporting exactly what is happening at the United Nations. Salma, I will turn this over to you in 30 seconds.
I just want to mention, and the American Civil Liberties Union.
And the ACLU as well. And we will continue sharing whatever happens. Please, if you have marched, if you have taken any action, this isn't yet another action that you need to take, especially white people. Get on it and take this action. Call your foreign ministries. It is so easy. The click to tweets are there. The links are there. Do it. Thank you so much, Salma. Thank you so much, Salimah, for joining us and me. The us is the proverbial us at the very last minute. I appreciate you both, and thank you to everybody who has attended. Bye.